Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and you can tell I'm bored as fuck today because this, I think, is going to be my third video in the same day. I'm going to be continuing the series that I've been doing on various theistic arguments for the existence of God by covering the moral argument, as well as some other arguments that people generally use in connection to God, morality, and other worldview-related matters. So let's begin with a basic moral argument, which goes like this. Without God, objective moral duties cannot exist. There are objective moral duties. Therefore, God must exist. Like all of the other syllogisms that we've discussed in the previous videos, on the face of it, this is structured correctly and seems, logical on the face of it. Of course, the crux of the matter here is, again, what happens when we examine the premises. To begin with, the first premise, objective moral values and duties can only exist if God exists. This is a very strange statement to make that I rarely see substantiated in any real fashion by theists. Of course, they will attempt to substantiate this by pointing out that on a metaphysical naturalist view, since you can't derive an ought from an is, and all you have available to you are is statements about the natural world, about what exists, you can't derive any oughts, and therefore, of course, you can't arrive at objective morality. This is fine as far as it goes. The problem is that it means that the first premise is only partially correct. It is true that without God, you cannot derive objective moral values and duties in the sense that they mean objective by, which I'll talk about in a second. The problem is that the other half is left out. The other half being that even if a God exists, even if a spiritual world exists, even if all of the metaphysical claims that any theist wants to posit exist, all of those metaphysical claims are merely themselves statements of fact. And therefore, if they are taking Hume's guillotine to be as absolute in their own case as they do in the case of the naturalist, they would be forced to conclude that, well, hey, what do you know? It's impossible to derive objective moral values from the existence of a God either. To give an example of this, let's say that there is a God, and people have souls and spirits and so on. Why should I care, aside from egoistic interests like the possibility of being punished, which are not objective in the sense that theists mean when they use this argument, what the God tells me I should and shouldn't do? If the God merely exists and gives commands, what about that existence and the fact that the commands come from that being makes them directly into an ought instead of an is? One can, of course, simply define our moral oughts as that which God commands. This is, in essence, what Matt Slick does. The problem with that is it's merely a definition. And in order to substantiate why one definition is necessary or better than the other, there would have to be an argument, and so once again, the is-ought gap would have to be breached. This, of course, is assuming a fairly standard theistic definition of objective morals, where the oughts derived by some means are universally binding for no other reason that they are, with no relation to any state of affairs. If we instead view objective moral oughts as the product of an assertoric hypothetical imperative, which, as I do, so a hypothetical imperative that is necessary and always in effect simply by nature of the moral actor involved, then it is just as possible to derive objective moral oughts from reality as it is to do so from the existence of God. In fact, it is far easier to use this sort of assertoric hypothetical imperative to derive moral oughts from the nature of human beings, which does not require a God for us to discern, by means of virtue ethics and eudaimonistic egoism than it is to derive any sort of such assertoric hypothetical imperative from the existence of God, separate from any kind of eudaimonistic egoism. One could say that the hypothetical imperative is that we wish to avoid pain and gain pleasure, and if God exists, we can avoid pain and gain pleasure by following his commands. But of course, this involves the same logic as an egoist without the existence of God. And even though a theist might claim that this sort of logic is better with a God because you can use the God's commands to ensure that people's egoistic interests line up with a normal kind of morality. First of all, it's not impossible to do that in the absence of a God. And second of all, that's assuming that the commands that they would have this God give, or believe that this God gives, are actually moral. Perhaps they're not. Perhaps the things that are commonly believed to be moral are not. Or if the things that are commonly believed to be moral are in fact moral, perhaps there's a reason that, apart from a God, since obviously they're not using the God to determine that they're moral, they're using the fact that they believe these things are moral to determine that there is a God and what the God would say. Furthermore, of course, you can run into, with this, the Euthyphro dilemma as well, which is sort of an expression of the Isot dilemma in relation to a God in a more specific manner. Essentially, it says that, is it the fact that God gives a certain set of commands that makes following the commands moral? And if that's the case, then we're just defining moral arbitrarily to mean whatever God says, and it's just as subjective and arbitrary as any other definition, since there isn't anything inherently moral about following orders. And on the other hand, are these moral commands, does God give these moral commands because they're already moral? In which the case, in the best case for the theist, this simply makes God a supernatural theistic mailman who merely communicates a moral order that is outside of him to us. And that's assuming that we could never figure that moral order apart from God out by ourselves, on which there is no reason to assume that we wouldn't be able to. Now, of course, the common theistic response to the Euthyphro dilemma is to attempt to say that God's nature is good. And so following God's commands is good because they are in line with God's nature. And so they're neither good because God gives them, or neither does God give them because they are good, but God is necessarily good, and so the commands that he gives must be good. The problem with this, again, is it falls afoul of the Euthyphro dilemma at a different level. Is God's nature good because it is God's nature? In which case, we're just defining good as godliness, and therefore, saying things like God is good are merely tautological, because you're basically just saying God is godly. Or is God's nature good because of some standard that we can apply to God's nature, which is what would be necessary in order to give good a non-silly tautological empty meaning, in which case, of course, once again, there's a standard outside of God. But let's move on to the second premise. The second premise states that there are objective moral oughts. Once again, I could say that on the one hand, the objective moral oughts of the kind that the theist is usually talking about when they mention this premise can't really exist. And on the other hand, I could say that objective moral oughts of the kind that I think can exist are possible without God. And so, the whole argument falls apart. But that's really more related to the first premise. On the second premise alone, it could be entirely possible for there to be no moral oughts, no objective moral oughts at all, and for us to think that there are. You would have to establish that there are objective moral oughts in order for this argument to work. And you'd have to establish it without just appealing to intuition, because intuition could have other reasons for thinking there are objective moral oughts than, actually being correct. And what that means is that if objective moral oughts do necessarily depend on God, then whatever argument you would give to substantiate premise 2, which is necessary to make the moral argument work, would have to already be assuming God or proving God, and therefore would make the moral argument unnecessary, or would have to be using a system that does not make reference to God at all, in which case, why do we need God? Making this moral argument unnecessary. Basically, at every turn, this argument launches the theist into multiple sets of dilemmas to which the only possible response is either that morality is essentially arbitrary, or that it doesn't require God in some way. And this is sort of what I mean when I say that there's actually no real cultural reason, that it's necessary to have a religion or believe in God in order to hold society together. If you believe that using that argument, like a sort of pragmatist argument for having religion, will work, then you are assuming that the person you're speaking to already shares your values and the values of your religion, and therefore it's not necessary for them to have the religion because they already share your values. Or if you're not assuming that they already share your values, you're assuming that they can be convinced to share those values, in which case, in the absence of religion, since you're also trying to convince them of religion, in which case, why not just use that argument to convince people instead of using religion? Now, of course, the possible response to this, in turn, is that it is possible to share religious values without having a good justification for them. And religion can provide that justification, which can ensure the sharing of those religious values continues and is maintained and has a firm footing. Which, on its face, once again, like most theistic arguments, is somewhat reasonable. This is the argument that, for instance, Jordan Peterson makes about the metaphorical substrate, and this is also the argument that Ben Shapiro makes about Judeo-Christian values. The problem with this is that, first of all, it's unclear that the specific religious values actually do determine what values people have, or are values that we would actually want. It's also unclear that the values that we have now came from religion and not other places. And it's also unclear that for instance, valuing democracy and human equality and stuff like that came from earlier and other places than Christianity. And Christianity itself justifies, in almost any sane reading, many things that we don't condone today, which we left aside not because of Christianity itself, but because of criticizing Christianity. So it seems that the values that we actually have now, and the values that we in a sense, value now, don't stem from any kind of religion, and so don't require religion to firm up their footing. On top of that, the question also is, if our values, the values that the Christian is trying to argue for, require something that has no evidence for it in order to have a quote-unquote firm foundation, then perhaps we should discard these values and select other ones that don't require something that must be assumed merely on the basis of it justifying these things that we've decided are important. See, the problem with the practical argument or the pragmatist argument for religion is that it's taking the values as primary and the God as merely a justification for the values. But the reason that people are arguing for religion using values instead of evidence is because there is no evidence for a God. But that means that God cannot actually provide a firm foundation for those values. And the fact that those values depend on something that is not in evidence might indicate that instead we should revise our values. On top of that, if it is okay to arbitrarily take something like God as given because it grants you values that you want to have, or grants you, quote unquote, a foundation for those values, why is it not equally valid to simply take those values themselves as granted without adding extra complexity and ad hoc / post hoc reasoning? As for the arguments commonly made along the lines of the idea that religion is necessary to hold society together on a common set of values, so that people have some one thing to appeal to in order to settle disputes about values. Religion simply doesn't help with that, except through indoctrination. Let me explain. Religion is based on faith. There is no evidence that leads you to a particular religion. There might be good arguments, although I've not seen them, but it might be reasonable to believe that there are arguments that can lead you to the idea of a God, right? But I've never seen any arguments that make sense of the idea that one of the world religions is actually a product of the argued for God and the others aren't. This is why you see the Kalam cosmological argument used by Jews, Islamic people, and also Christians, right? Because it can lead to any one of those religions. So what this means is that even if there's evidence for a God, there's no evidence for a particular religion, and I don't even think there's evidence for God, which means that you essentially have to select a religion on the basis either of faith or on the values you already have. In either case, if two people of different values exist, they would just pick different religions. And if two people picked different religions on faith, they would have nothing to decide between them. Sure, people within a religion would have a common pseudo-objective, or I guess intersubjective in this case, standard to decide between themselves on the basis of morality. Although even this is problematic because of the serious issues people have interpreting the moral teachings of their scriptures. But again, this is entirely possible to do. This doesn't really help because what this means is that religion, it can't provide, the only way that a religion can provide a common system on which people can operate their values on is either if those people selected the religion because they already share values, in which case they don't need the religion in order to have a way to decide between themselves on the basis of their values, or on faith, which people could adopt different systems of philosophy and ethics on faith as well, and then the people that adopted the same thing on faith would have, again, an equally common system to decide based on. And religions don't give us a way to decide between people of differing religions, just as value systems don't give us a way to decide between people that have different value systems. So religions don't really offer an objective thing to appeal to any more than moral, assuming value systems does, or being without religion. On top of that, the possible response to this that I would expect someone like Ben Shapiro to make is that if you could get everyone in a society to agree to a religion, then there's sort of a common cultural fabric that everyone can agree on, right? Well, how would you get everyone in a society to agree on a religion if they would naturally have different value systems, which dictates what religion they choose, essentially, or might naturally be led to different faiths, and so on. Well, indoctrination. The problem is, as John Stuart Mill pointed out in his treatise on utilitarianism, you can indoctrinate an ethical system into kids just like you can a religion. If we really want to ensure that everyone in our society has a common value system to be operating on, religion is no more necessary than just selecting a moral system at random, right? On top of this, I actually don't think that the selection of values and a moral system is as arbitrary as the selection of religion. Because you can, at least I believe, and you see this in the videos on my YouTube channel, actually construct a value system that is not arbitrary, that you could, argue people to agree with, that has nothing to do with, subjective, selection based on existing, value systems that can differ between people, or, assuming on faith and stuff like that. I just granted the theist premise that without God all morals are subjective in the foregoing argument merely to make the point that religion doesn't solve the problem, because it's in the same position as the average value system people have now is anyway, right? Like, having religion didn't solve the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, just like, being like, and it wouldn't solve, so it can't solve a deep-rooted conflict in society like the one we're seeing now between, liberals and conservatives. Anyway, because the liberals and conservatives would just interpret their religion differently, or select different religions. And if you select different religions, since they're not evidence-based, there's no way to decide between them except on the basis of values. And if people already don't share values, that's not really going to help now, is it? And so if your argument for religion is based on values, well, you're stuck. Okay, I think that's it for this video.